So good morning and welcome to the webinar on ACEs and epigenetics. My name is Sarah Sarelson and I am the Executive Director of the Wyoming Children's Trust Fund and Prevent Child Abuse Wyoming. I have worked a little over 15 years now in child welfare, child prevention, child intervention, in a variety of different roles, starting in this position in September of 2020. And I like to share a random fact so that we can all get to know each other just a little bit. And this morning, my random fact is that I often say that I was born into this role because when I was born, my parents were house parents at the attention homes in Cheyenne. And so I lived there with them as they were house parents for children who were involved in the system or needing a break from their parents for a period of time. And so I blame my parents for literally having me born into this role. So good morning, everyone, and I'm glad to be here with you, and I'll let my co-presenter introduce herself.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Nicole Nieder. I'm the Business Office Coordinator with the Trust Fund. My work history is I've previously worked for the Department of Corrections. I was a CPS caseworker for the Department of Family Services. I worked for the Wyoming Guardianship Corporation before joining the Trust Fund in November of 2020. I think I kind of I guess my random fact is I kind of fell into social work. I took a little bit longer to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I liked the social work field just because there was lots of different options for kind of specialties to work in. And that way I knew if I kind of got burned out in one area or needed a little bit of a change, there was still lots of other options I could do with my degree. So that's kind of how I ended up in the social work field. And everybody would like to put their name, who they work with, or what area of the state they're tuning in from. And if you have a random fact, we love to hear those. You can drop all of that information into the chat box. And thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And let's go ahead and get started. Although we can recall and describe with words much of what has happened in our lives, we know that the memory of human experience is stored in our bodies and not just in our minds. Today, we're going to talk about the ACEs study. We're going to cover a little bit on brain development, epigenetics. We'll share some Wyoming data pieces and talk just briefly about protective factors. We could spend days and days and weeks talking about all of this information. So we're going to give you clips of it in this 1 hour webinar today. But know that if there is additional information that you are wanting, or you want to be connected with somebody in your area to have more in-depth trainings, we can absolutely connect you and help you with all of those pieces. As we get started this morning, we're going to hear from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. If you have not listened to any of her webinars, I would recommend that you write down her name, Nadine Burke-Harris, but we'll go ahead and get started with just a short clip from one of her messages.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a pathogen chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach.
So many of us know what happened to make her rethink her entire approach. Somebody walked into her office, she's a pediatrician, and gave her a copy of the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which most of us call the ACE study. So it was developed and co-sponsored by Kaiser Permanente of San Diego, California, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Onda, who designed the ACE study while he was working as a senior scientist at the CDC, has reviewed and approved all the information from the study that I'll report to you today. Those of you that have been fortunate enough to be more involved with some of the ACE's work know that we continue every single day to still work very closely with Dr. Onda and are very fortunate to have his partnership. The original ACE study was conducted at Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 1997 with 2 waves of data collection. Over 17,000 health maintenance organization members from Southern California receiving physical exams completed confidential surveys regarding their childhood experiences and then current health status and behaviors. The population surveyed were between the ages of 19 and 94. Most were college educated, and they all had excellent health insurance at the time. This slide shows the 10 categories of ACEs that were studied. The first group, so those are the indicators of household dysfunction, which included things like growing up with a substance abusing household member, alcohol or drugs, parental separation or divorce, growing up with mentally ill household members or caregivers, witnessing intimate partner violence. Specifically, at that time, it was having a battered mother, or criminal behavior as evidenced by a household member being imprisoned. There were 3 forms of childhood abuse that were studied: emotional, physical, and sexual, and 2 forms of neglect were included: emotional and physical. And as you can see from the percentages on the slide, ACEs are common in this middle class, well-educated population. ACEs are also highly interrelated. When there was one ACE in the life of a child, 87% of the time, at least one of the other 9 ACEs also occurred. The fact that the 10 categories of ACEs tended to cluster called for this new way of looking at how ACEs might affect health and social well-being. Because adverse childhood experiences are so highly interrelated, it didn't make sense to look at how single categories of ACEs influenced health and social problems. Instead, Drs. Onda and Folletti developed an ACE score. This score is simply the count of the number of categories of ACEs that each person reported, from 0 to 10. Each category counts as 1 point in the ACE score. So if a person experienced physical abuse, no matter how many times or what the severity of the abuse, the ACE score is 1. If the person experienced physical abuse and had a substance abusing parent, the ACE score is 2. Think of the ACE score as a measure of the childhood biological stress dose. As the ACE score goes up, on average, the exposure to the developmental effects of toxic stress increases. What we know is that adverse childhood experiences are common, and they tend to cluster. In this illustration, you see that only 1/3 of people in the ACE study had a score of 0. 16% had scores of 4 or more. Let's talk just a little bit about brain development. The human central nervous system connects us to ourselves, to other people and to the world around us. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord that integrate all of our senses and information from those receptors located throughout the human body. It regulates internal body functions and manages elaborate chemical and electrical signaling. Cells in our nervous system, as we know, are called neurons. They're stunningly effective at processing and transmitting information, and they have a central purpose in doing so: to adapt in ways that keep us alive. Dr. Martin Teicher of Harvard University has reviewed and approved all of the brain science facts in this presentation. So on the far left, we see a set of brain cells, or neurons, and what they might look like at the time of birth. There aren't many connections between these cells at birth. Babies are born with only the connections and brain functions they need at this point in life. Most of the wiring of our brains occurs as the result of life experiences from our senses. By age 6, those same brain cells now have many connections. The wiring of the brain, or those making of complex neural networks, is experience dependent. What gets experienced the most tends to lead to more robust connections between nerve cells that form networks. This process is called branching. The last section of the slide represents about the time of puberty, around age 14. Notice that now there are fewer connections between the brain cells than there were at age 6. This is because the least experienced connections tend to withdraw at about the time of puberty. This process is called pruning. This phenomenon helps us to explain why neglect or not getting the experiences that we need can have such a powerful negative impact on health and social functioning. One of those elaborate systems is the limbic system. The brain regions in the limbic system control many things, including physical balance, internal temperature regulation, and digestion. It also has an important role in the fight or flight response to danger. The hippocampus and amygdala are two regions in the limbic system that are vital for forming healthy relationships. These areas are the most affected areas of the brain from any emotional trauma. They can make a trauma survivor fearful, especially when events and situations remind the survivor of their past trauma. Another brain region with seedling cells is the cerebellar vermis, which connects the two halves of the cerebellum. The vermis is also the part of the brain that regulates the release of our feel-good brain chemistry. The vermis is sensitive to all forms of maltreatment just before puberty, and those symptoms may not fully emerge until early adulthood. The vermis may be the seat of mental health. It has a role in virtually every mental illness, including schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, and depression. We're only beginning to understand the biological connections between trauma-induced adaptations in the vermis and serious and persistent mental illness. Some brain regions have several periods of sensitivity that span throughout childhood. The corpus callosum is one of those. It's a superhighway that connects the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. Children exposed to various forms of adversity early in life are at an increased risk for a broad range of developmental difficulties, affecting both cognitive and emotional adjustments. People who report higher ACE scores are more likely to have health and social problems. As the ACE score goes up, the percentage of people with health and social problems also goes up. We call this a dose-response relationship. You know dose-response: the more gas you put in your car, the more miles that you can drive, sometimes more than others, depending on the gas prices. But in this case, where there is a higher dose of adverse childhood experiences, the higher the percent of people with health problems. All of the data slides that I'll show you today are formatted in the same way. Along the bottom horizontal axis is the ACE score from 0 on the left to 4 or more on the right. The vertical axis is the percent of people who have the disease or condition. So in this first set of bars, on the far left, we see that the percent of people who became regular cigarette smokers by age 12 goes up as each level of the ACE score goes up. In the second set of bars, we see the percent who were smokers as adults also goes up in this stepwise fashion as the score goes from 0 to 4 or more. People with higher ACE scores have increased risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. About 4% of people with an ACE score of 0 developed COPD, while more than double that percent of people, about 9%, with an ACE score of 4 or more developed COPD. ACEs lead to the early onset of smoking, which is then sustained throughout adulthood and eventually leads to a high risk of smoking-related lung disease. So now we can begin to anticipate why ACEs are related to certain behaviors and social conditions. Here we see the risk of becoming an alcoholic increases 6-fold from an ACE score of 0 to a score of 6. And ACEs affect relationships. People with higher ACE scores are more likely to marry an alcoholic. Think for just a minute about how these indicate how ACEs tend to be transmitted from one generation to the next. Depression is the leading cause of disability in developed countries. Here we see that the risk of depression increases for both men and women in a dose-response fashion as the ACE score goes up. ACEs are held in the body, leading to mental, physical, behavioral health problems in adulthood. Some of these problems are unintentionally handed to the next generation. Becoming an alcoholic, marrying an alcoholic, and suffering from depression are a part of the intergenerational transmission of adverse childhood experiences. Research seems to bear out the fact that the toxic stress of ACEs might not only be experienced by an individual, but could also be transmitted from one generation to the next at a genetic level. So in simplified terms, it may be possible to pass on trauma to our children and grandchildren, making the implications of ACEs more devastating and far-reaching than we had ever imagined. Some researchers who have studied historic periods of trauma, like the American Civil War or the Holocaust, now suspect that abuse, neglect, deprivation, and trauma can impair the functioning at some level for future generations who may not even experience the same living in those adverse circumstances. Epigenetics. It's the study of cellular and physiological phenotype trait variations that are caused by external or environmental factors that switch genes on and off and affect how cells read genes instead of being caused by changes in the DNA sequence. So this means that while the field of genetics looks at the expression of the genetic code, epigenetics studies factors that influence the expression of the gene. So research in the area of epigenetics has concluded that during early life, the environment that we live in can affect the way that our genes are expressed. Environmental factors like security, bonding, and love can alter how our genes switch on and off or simply operate. Differing genetic expressions can occur without causing any changes or any mutation to the underlying gene themselves. The environment we experience, especially when we are young, can affect which of our genes are active and which remains dormant. Epigenetics is this new scientific field that explains how experience gets under our skin. Our genes are contained in the DNA of our cells. Genes provide instructions for cells to become specialized into liver cells, heart cells, so forth. They also contain keys to disease and well-being through the life course. Epigenetics tells us about the ways that the instructions on our genes are used. So it's important to understand just a little bit about how DNA is organized to understand epigenetics. Think of a long strand of fishing line, many yards of it. In order to fish without the line being tangled or disorganized, all of us as fishermen put the line on a reel so that the line can be let out or brought back in to stay organized. We have thousands of genes so that our long strands of DNA are tightly condensed into chromosomes in the nucleus of our cells. Looking more closely like the fishing line on a reel, the DNA is tightly wrapped around protein balls called histones. Epigenetics involves the attachment of chemicals, so it's represented by the orange cylinder here in the diagram, to the DNA at a particular gene. The attachment of that chemical can prevent the gene's message from being available to be read. Other types of chemical attachments can cause the gene to be open, so instructions can be read by the cell. Here is where this is relevant to ACEs. New research suggests that stressful experience can influence these chemical attachments that then are the reading of our genetic code in ways that can have negative effects on the way that our cells function. So this may be an important reason why ACEs are related to so many health and social problems. The hopeful part of this is that other types of positive life experiences may affect the reading of our genes that may reverse the negative effects of ACEs or have positive effects on human development, health, and well-being. Our brains are continuously making predictions. When we hear a rustling noise, our brains are predicting whether the noise is a wild animal nearby or just the wind blowing through nearby branches. Our past experiences shape our brain's predictions of current experience. Sights, smells, the meanings we have from a similar past experience all affect our expectations. If you've experienced happy days when the sweet smell of a cherry blossom hung in the spring air, that smell of cherry blossom may activate those brain predictions of another happy day. But if on the same type of day you had a frightening experience, when you smell cherry blossoms, your brain would predict something to happen next. Amazingly, some brain predictions can be passed from one generation to the next. In one of the studies, epigenetics conditioned laboratory rats to be afraid of the smell of cherry blossoms. When the cherry blossom odor came into the rat's environment, they huddled together, stunned with fear until the odor was removed. These rats then had babies, pups, who grew up without any exposure to cherry blossoms. This generation of rats were separated from their parents and placed in a different environment. When the smell of cherry blossoms was put into their environment, the babies, they were jumpy. They had heightened sensitivity to the smell of cherry blossoms. The response to the smell of cherry blossoms had been passed on to the pups by epigenetic markers. So why might it be a good thing for sensitivity or fear to be passed from one generation to another through epigenetics? Why might it be a good thing for rats to feel fear, even though no one instructed them to fear cherry blossoms? Survival. Fear can protect a species from dangerous situations or toxins. It may be adaptive for fear to be passed down from one generation to the next if it can prevent poisoning or avoid dangers. The field of epigenetics may help us to understand how groups of people may be deeply affected by historical trauma when the epigenetic response from our parents or ancestors can be passed on to subsequent generations. This can happen despite current efforts to care for one another well. So, how do we heal the wounds of our ancestors? We don't know the answer to that question, but what we do know is that we are the ones responsible today because we are the adults. No one is waiting in the wings. So let's think again about the positive side of experience being passed from one generation to the next. So scientists are testing whether positive characteristics like nurturing behavior can be inherited from one's parents and grandparents. The field of epigenetics provides us with hope that our ways of relating to one another can create these lasting positive changes in genetic expression. How creating self-healing communities now can lay an enduring path of generational healing and recovery.
Now we're going to jump into some Wyoming specific data. So in 2020, Wyoming surveyed a sample of adults on their experiences with ACEs before the age of 18, and then compared these numbers to the same survey that was done in 25 other states. As you can see from the graph on the slide, 19.4% of Wyoming adults have experienced 4 or more ACEs before they were 18 years old, compared to 15.6% of adults in the other 25 states that were surveyed. The Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, or BRFIS, is the nation's premier system of health-related telephone surveys that collect state data about U.S. residents regarding their health-related risks, behaviors, chronic health conditions, and use of preventative services. This was established in 1984 with 15 states, and the BRFIS now collects data in all 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia and 3 U.S. territories. So if you want to scan the QR code on the screen, it will take you to the report from the study that we are going to discuss. For this report, data was collected between 2015 and 2017 from more than 144,000 adults in 25 states. Now, if we take a look at the percentage on this slide, over half the adults surveyed in 25 different states have reported experiencing at least one type of ACE. So think about that in terms of the people that you work with, the families maybe that you help, those people that are in your personal lives. ACEs affects people directly and indirectly due to the likelihood of you knowing someone with an ACE score. Among Wyoming adult residents, the highest number of ACEs occurred in those who are age 18 to 24 years old, Native American, those with an annual income under $15,000, those without a high school diploma, and those who are unable to work. And those with the higher ACE scores also tend to report higher levels of risk factors such as smoking, obesity, depression, and diabetes. According to data collected during the 2020 Wyoming BRFIS, information provided by adults reporting on their mental health, which includes their stress levels, feelings of depression, and problems with their emotions, they reported their mental health was not good 14 or more of the past 30 days. And as you can see on the slide, the risk factors reported are higher among those who have experienced past sexual abuse. So some key numbers in Wyoming are that 27% of Wyoming households live below the 200% federal poverty rate. The maternal mortality rate in Wyoming is on the rise, and 8.9% of Wyoming children do not have health insurance. So our goal should be healing the effects of childhood trauma now, so that even the possibility of passing it on to future generations is minimized. As a community, we should all have this focus in the work that we do.
What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies.
By preventing ACEs in children, we can potentially reduce the risk factors when they are adults, such as adults having pulmonary disease, heart disease, obesity, and depressive disorders. So how do we put all this together to make a case for understanding ACEs as a powerful pathway to health and well-being? Well, now that we understand that ACEs are common and they have a strong cumulative impact on the risk of common health and social problems, preventing ACEs and their intergenerational transmission is the greatest opportunity for improving the well-being of the human populations. In fact, the ACE study team and ACE interface believe this is the greatest opportunity of our time. As you can see on this slide, the percentage of various health and social problems that epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs, the calculation that is commonly used to do this in public health studies is called population attributable risk. This is displayed as a percentage as the oil spill on the slide. So the percentage of a problem that is coded by the oil spill represents the percentage of each problem that is potentially preventable by preventing ACEs. And as you can see, the percentages are quite large. And these high percentages on this chart are rarely seen in other public health studies. The cumulative effects of ACEs reflect a powerful opportunity for prevention. No matter if you are working to prevent heart disease or cancer, end homelessness or hopelessness, or improve business profitability, as we align a portion of our work around a common goal of preventing the accumulation of ACEs and moderating their effects, we will reduce all of these problems and many others all at once. The ACE study provides us with the straightforward information about the consequences of toxic stress during childhood. This scientific research gives us powerful information we can use every day to improve the health, safety, prosperity, and longevity. But the ACE study isn't a detailed roadmap of services or programs. It's an invitation for all of us to be pioneers. This news is simply too important to wait for someone else to design a detailed roadmap. Through our collective knowledge and action, we are the ones with the power to shift the dynamics within our own families, our communities, and society that can lead to high ACE scores. Our culture has built separate systems and ways of thinking about health and social problems. This way of doing business in society is sometimes called a siloed approach. Each silo has its own budget, training, and mental model about preventing and treating the individual types of problems that is their focus. The ACE study and the knowledge about their effects on brain structure and function now show us that viewing health and social problems as separate issues is an illusion. It's an illusion based upon outdated mental models. And now that we have many common health and social problems caused based upon the powerful impact of ACEs throughout the life course, we used to talk about breaking down silos. but that's not practical because human nature and organizational behavior is such that the budgets and priorities in siloed systems are too well defended. The good news, though, is that none of us have to stop working on the issues we are passionate about. If we simply add a thread to our work that's focused on preventing the accumulation of ACEs, that common thread will connect and align all of our work in powerful ways. When people hear about the ACE study findings, they often ask about resilience. People get excited about the notion of resilience, in part because it reminds us that our supportive actions matter. Our desire for resilience leads naturally to a search for ways to help families and communities. 3 protective systems interact and guide positive adaptation. These powerful systems are individual capabilities, attachment and belonging with caring and competent people, and protective community, faith, and cultural processes. What do we know about individuals who do well despite adversity? We know that the 3 protective systems are nested. People do best when they are living in thriving families and communities. We can help one another to develop personal attributes that help us all weather life's storms. Personal attributes like positive view of one's life, self-efficacy, and self-regulation are all discussed at length in the resilience literature. And we're also going to talk about the 5 protective factors. So there's parental resilience, which is having the tools to manage stressful situations and the way parents respond to those situations. This is the ability to overcome difficult experiences, as well as learn from those experiences and build their own resilience. Next is social connections. This is developing positive relationships that can in turn offer support, provide a safe space for parents to discuss difficult situations or parenting strategies, and positive relationships that parents know they are not alone. Knowledge of parenting and child development is parents understanding their child's development and have realistic expectations of what their child is capable of at that level. This is also beneficial for parents understanding their role in their child's physical, cognitive, language, and social emotional development. Concrete support in times of need is having access to concrete supports or services to address the family's needs, as well as reduce their stress level. It's important that some families don't know what is available or even understand what they can ask for. Some families just don't know what they are missing or what they could even be in need of help with. And lastly is social and emotional competence of children. And this is family and child interactions that help children to develop the ability to communicate clearly, recognize and regulate their emotions, and establish and maintain relationships. We can add to the positive side of the resilience scale by piling on positive experiences, especially through responsive relationships. The one thing that most children who develop resilience have in common is a stable, committed relationship with a supportive parent, a caregiver, or another adult. Adults need these supportive relationships also. Culture is an umbrella term that encompasses the collective social behavior, institutions, and norms found in human societies, which include collective knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, and habits of the individuals in these groups. Now, as you can see on the iceberg on this slide, the surface culture, or the things that we can see, are very few compared to the deep culture we all have as individuals. And as we consider each protective factor, we will have you consider a few questions that are listed on the slide. So how does culture impact families as they seek to build protective factors? How does your own culture shape how you feel, think, and behave? And how do differences in culture impact helping others build protective factors? Cultural safety is the ultimate goal when working with families so that they feel seen and heard. To achieve this goal, we first need to be culturally aware. Understanding the difference between your own culture and those that have a different culture from your own, it's important to remember the differences in attitudes and values. Be culturally sensitive by being aware of cultural differences and not judging those with different cultures. Educate yourself and your understanding of cultural trauma. As seen on the previous slide, what may show on the surface in today's world can just be the tip of an iceberg to a culture, but culture goes back many generations, and things that historically have been traumatic can evolve over time to become somebody's culture today. And lastly, commit to self-evaluation. Be aware of and understand the power imbalances that can be present in the work you do. Using these 3 strategies will create a culturally safe environment for families where they are free to express their own cultures, as well as feeling seen and heard. In turn, will create a safe space for children and families. And like any culture, it's impossible to fully understand unless you live in a culture with all the differences and experience all the finer details. It's okay to admit that you don't know everything, but it's about respect. Slow down, listen, build relationships, develop trust, and develop understanding. Implementing all these things in your work will build a culturally safe environment for children and families. There is a predictable pattern to transformative change. It begins with discovery and communication, which leads people to clarify their values and thinking. With new knowledge and new habits of thinking, people change the actions they take in everyday life. The collective actions of many people shape a new reality that is ratified in organizational and policy change. The truth is that people create a new reality long before new laws are passed. Change is up to us. It's shaped by our thoughts, our conversations, the way we relate with one another in relationships, in families, and in communities. And as we work to prevent the accumulation of ACEs, let's keep in mind that we don't have to get ACE scores to 0. Bringing scores down any amount will have huge effects. We might not be able to prevent a first ACE from occurring in a family, but we certainly can notice when children have 5 ACEs and make sure that number doesn't go to 10. So as we thread through all of our work, a new focus of supporting adults, particularly adults who through no fault of their own have experienced many ACEs when they were children, we will prevent ACEs for the next generation. We live at a time of great hope and promise. The largest public health discovery of our time is about family, community, children. It's about us. Our actions to prevent ACEs, whether large or small, can profoundly improve our future. And Sarah just dropped a link to a survey in the chat that we would ask that you complete. We have one more video to show, and then that concludes our presentation for today. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
We have a beautiful little boy named Bronson. I have no idea how we got so lucky, but he's just such an awesome little dude. We're actually excited to be parenting him different than how we were kind of raised growing up in certain capacities. Growing up, my dad, he just wanted to work on the railroad and then come home and drink every day. I wanted to hang out with him a bunch, but it always seemed like it was taking away from his time to drink.
When my mom was pregnant with me, my dad was like pushing 50 and decided to stop drinking. And prior to that, he was, a chronic, alcoholic. And so I grew up in a sober house, but with parents who didn't talk about it. I didn't know how to have a healthy relationship with alcohol or with anything because it was really presented to me like anybody who drinks regularly has a problem.
I went to treatment the first time in 2017, relapsed in like 3 or 4 weeks after I got out.
So he went to rehab again a year later. And during that period of time, I did a ton of reading and researching, and it changed my whole career. I ended up working in substance abuse and mental health treatment.
I I knew 100% that she was in my corner.
And so embarking on the learning process together kept us on the same page with the same vocabulary. So it wasn't until, we were in our healthy, balanced life that we were ready to have kids.
And with our son, it just, anything that he does, I want to support him. I don't care what it is. Basically reinforcing that support that I didn't have.
Your parents can have done the best that they could, but that doesn't mean they didn't traumatize you. But we have to be honest about these things to stop repeating them.